you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Right. So I'm very happy to be talking to you about some of the work that I have been doing with some very good colleagues of mine, especially Pedro Mediano and Fernando Rosas. And hopefully you've all heard Pedro's talk a couple of days ago, and hopefully all the first part of this will be familiar. But in case that you're not, let's come with me and solve a little murder mystery. So imagine that you are Sherlock Holmes and you have to figure out which of these individuals here perpetrated some crime, such as stealing some cookies, which we know in the UK is very terrible crime. And you might have a witness as a good detective, and this witness might tell you that the culprit wore a mustache and some glasses. And this lets you identify some of the potential suspects that you can exclude, but it still doesn't uniquely identify who is the culprit. However, you're a very good detective, so you actually find another witness. And this witness also lets you eliminate some of the potential suspects, but once again, not all of them. However, if you combine the information provided by the two witnesses, now you can uniquely identify who is the culprit. And this scenario illustrates the fact that when you have multiple sources of information, you can have these sources provide information that is unique to each of them, which the other source does not have access to, like the information about the hat or the mustache. But you can also have redundant information that is separately provided by each of the two sources. Crucially, however, you can also have synergistic information. This is information that neither of the two sources was able to give you, but that they were able to give you together, such as in this case, the information about the identity of the culprit. And of course, all of this can be neatly formalized in the framework of information decomposition, which you've all heard about already, whereby we can talk about synergistic, unique, and redundant information. And in particular, as the talk from Dr. Mediano was mentioning, you can further generalize information decomposition and obtain integrated information decomposition, which generalizes this question to differences across time. So you can have persistent redundancy or persistent synergy, or any combination of these four atoms with any other of the four. And thanks to this approach, we can then decompose the information that is present, for instance, in the human brain. So if we apply this framework to empirical functional MRI time series obtained from the Human Connectome project, we can identify which regions in the brain are especially rich in redundancy, shown here in blue, and which regions are especially rich in synergy, which is that shown here in red. And if you're familiar with the anatomy of the brain, you might recognize that redundancy is especially prominent in sensorimotor systems, whereas synergy is especially prominent in the default mode and frontoparietal network, which are higher order cognitive networks and have previously been implicated in consciousness as well. And we will get to that in a little bit. But for now, you don't need to just take my word for it, because we ran a neuroscience term-based meta-analysis on these results. And indeed, what we find is that synergy is more strongly associated with high-level cognition, whereas redundancy is more associated with terms from sensorimotor systems and cognitive functions accordingly. In particular, we were also able to show that there is a correlation between synergy and markers of evolution, such as evolutionary cortical expansion, measured by comparing the brains of chimpanzees and humans in terms of morphology, but also with the extent to which each region expresses human accelerated brain genes. So the more synergistic a region, the more it is expanded in evolution. Now, the reason why we are particularly interested in information decomposition and synergy in this particular talk is because integrated information decomposition has been shown to be a way to decompose integrated information, which is, as all of us I think know, a potential measure of consciousness proposed by Giulio Tononi and others. I should preface this by saying that this is the IIT 2.0 version of integrated information. Other versions have since been developed that more closely follow the intuitions of the developers of IIT, but unfortunately for our purposes, they also depart from the realm of Shannon information theory, which is where integrated information decomposition is applicable. So here, what you can see is the decomposition of IIT 2.0, integrated information, in terms of this integrated information decomposition framework. So these information atoms. And in particular, what you can see is that the original version of phi was including synergy and transfer terms, but was also subtracting redundancy. And this has been pinpointed as the reason why sometimes this measure phi can take on negative values, which some people have argued does not seem plausible because you cannot really have something that is negatively integrated. And so one very simple solution that is made available by integrated information decomposition is to create this revised measure of integrated information, or phi R for short, which does not remove the redundancy from the system and instead sums up synergy and transfer terms. And we think that this might be a more accurate representation of what integrated information should be within the framework of Shannon information theory, of course. So now let's come to the other part of the title, which is a workspace for consciousness and cognition. And I think we're also all familiar with the idea behind global workspace theory and its later global neuronal workspace. But briefly, this is the idea that the brain, or any system that performs, in some sense, the functions that we attribute to consciousness, should comprise an architecture that has specialized modules that perform specialized computations, a bit akin to Fodor's modules in the modularity of mind. And then there is a global workspace where all of this information comes together and becomes integrated. And then subsequently, it becomes broadcasted to the rest of the brain so that the brain is updated about what is most important to know and can inform further processing. And I think at this point, it should be clear that the integration of information is also quite central, literally in the case of this visual, to the question of how does the global workspace relate to consciousness. And so we thought maybe we can use this framework of integrated information decomposition to come up with what might look like a synergistic workspace for the brain. Namely, if you imagine, as we showed earlier, that you have specialized modules in the brain that mostly perform redundant computation in the sense that they have multiple availability of the same information, which provides robustness, then what you need when it comes to integration is you need synergy. At some point, this information that is separately stored in these individualized processors needs to come together. And that means that it needs to become integrated. And that means that it needs to become synergy. But if the workspace is a set of regions rather than just one region, then maybe there are separate parts of it that are dedicated more closely to the integration and separate parts that are dedicated more closely to the broadcasting. And in particular, these broadcasters need to be creating redundancy, by which I mean that when something is broadcasted, by definition, there exist copies of it that are present at multiple locations, which means that something that is broadcasted becomes redundantly present in the system. And so we can identify synergy as the integration part of the workspace and redundancy as the broadcasting, that is redundancy on the part of the workspace itself as the broadcasting. And then, of course, the rest of the environment can close this loop between integration and broadcasting. And so the question becomes, we have come up with this particular idea, can we find something like this in the actual human brain? And the answer is yes, to some extent we can. Because if we just focus here on the regions that belong to the workspace, that is, we identified before as being those high synergy regions. And I should add that that analysis, like this one, is entirely data-driven. And nonetheless, despite this being a purely data-driven analysis, we still find that default mode and frontoparietal high-level networks are the ones where most of the synergy is, which is most of the integration, which stands to reason with a lot of other empirical research that we know of. But if we then further divide this workspace in terms of whether the regions are mostly talking to their own module or mostly talking to other modules, that is, to the rest of the brain, in terms of synergy or redundancy, then what we find is that the regions that perform this broadcasting, which is to say regions that generate redundant information in the rest of the brain, are not, once again, not randomly distributed in this workspace. Rather, they coincide very strongly with regions that belong to the frontoparietal control network, whereas the default mode network seems to be mostly associated with receiving and integrating this information from the rest of the brain. And so again, this is a data-driven way to distinguish between senders and receivers of information, not in terms of directionality, I should add, but rather in terms of the roles that they perform in the brain. And once again, it seems that this dissociates the roles of well-known resting state networks, in this case, the default mode versus the frontoparietal network. And this is interesting because some of the work of Dehaene and others has pinpointed to parts of the frontoparietal network, in particular prefrontal cortex, as being potentially relevant for this act of broadcasting of information by the global workspace. But so far, no investigation of consciousness, empirical investigation of consciousness, has yet come into this talk. And we would like to address that, of course. And in particular, the approach that we take is what you might consider a comparative approach, which is to say, we want to understand what changes in the brain when consciousness, someone's state of consciousness changes. But of course, we all know that consciousness can change because of a variety of reasons. For instance, someone might become anesthetized, but many different anesthetics exist. Or someone might undergo some kind of brain injury. But of course, we know that different brain injuries can lead to a disorder of consciousness. Crucially, however, if we believe that there is some common underlying substrate that supports consciousness in the human brain, then maybe looking at what is similar across anesthesia and disorders of consciousness might help us to figure out what that substrate is. And that is precisely what we did here. So we repeated the same analysis as before, which is to say, integrated information decomposition of bold signals from the human brain using fMRI. And in this case, rather than using Human Connectome project data, we use data from a cohort of 22 patients with disorders of consciousness and 15 patients who were scanned twice. Once while they were awake, and then once in the process of anesthesia, which includes both being anesthetized and then subsequently recovered. And when they are awake, we use them as controls for those DOC patients as well. And our question is simply, can we find regions in the human brain where this measure of revised integrated information, FIR, is reliably reduced whenever consciousness is lost, regardless of whether it's lost because of anesthesia or brain injury? And can those same regions also show increases in FIR, so in our measure of consciousness, when consciousness is restored following anesthesia? Because if some regions can meet all of these conditions, then we think we have a good case to make that those regions are supporting consciousness. And of course, I wouldn't be giving this talk if the answer were no, because actually we can find regions that reduce their amount of integrated information, both as a result of anesthesia and as a result of a disorder of consciousness, and restore, thank you, and restore their amount of integrated information after consciousness is recovered following anesthesia. But the really interesting thing is that those regions, once again, are not distributed randomly in the brain, but rather they coincide with regions of the default mode network that we had just identified as being part of this synergistic workspace. And this is entirely not based on our identification of the workspace. The workspace was identified in a data-driven fashion, and these results are identified in a data-driven fashion on separate data. And nevertheless, they come to coincide on what should be relevant for consciousness, which I think is rather remarkable given the convergence of theory and empirical data. And this is just showing that indeed all of these are present in the default mode network in particular, just as the picture at the center here is showing. And so the hope of this work is that maybe we can find in the meaning of, in the rather different meanings of integration that are used by global workspace and integrated information theory, maybe we can find some confluence in the brain within this synergistic workspace. So maybe it's about the way that we look at these. And if we refine our understanding of the workspace a bit, and we refine our understanding of integrated information a bit, maybe we can find a confluence there, which I think many of us would think is sensible to expect. And of course, a lot of this work is available online as preprints, and I would encourage all of you to check them out. The latest one was uploaded 2 days ago, so you can have a look for yourselves. And finally, I should say that, of course, this was a synergistic effort with very many people, including in particular Pedro Mediano and Fernando Rosas, but also my supervisor, Dr. Stamatakis, and many, many others to whom my heartfelt thanks go. And of course, my funders, Kate Cambridge, and the organizers for having me here. And if you have any thoughts or questions or suggestions, you can ask your questions now, or you can reach me offline. Thanks a lot, and I hope I'm